So something I've been thinking about lately is the degree to which we rely upon models, use models, and it's not just, the way that we model things in the world and the way that we try to understand the world through models, but the way that we look for models in our understanding of ourselves, that we have a need to represent to ourselves who we really are, and we struggle with something like self-understanding. And when you look at this question of, who am I? Or how am I to understand myself? Where am I to look to find the model upon which my self-understanding is to best proceed? It's it's quite fascinating that in one sense, on both the personal level and the cultural level, or the cosmic level, we're without resources, or it's ambiguous, it's just uncertain, and you're plighted with the responsibility of having to choose and make something of oneself, despite the fact that you're not replicatable like a model, that there's never been another you, there'll never be another you. And when you look at everyone else, you could see how they've lived their lives and what they've done, but it won't tell you who you should fall in love with, who you should marry, what poems you should write, what books you should read, what friends you should have, what exactly you should do with your life, or should you do anything? Should you feel obligated to do something with your life, or shouldn't you? Where will you get the model that will tell you what is the appropriate response to those questions? See, now it's not just the individual level. Now you could say, well, you look to your family or to your culture or to your friends, and I think you do that, okay? But they can't really give you the ultimate answers to the particulars. We end up serving perhaps as the model for others, or we try to imagine the model that best serves what we take to be our own best interests. And I think this is, part of the issue is when you move to cultural, when you move to the cultural level, I think this was part of the ambiguity of the religious folks versus the more scientific folks. That when religious minded people, and as much as you want to challenge the dogma and critique the dogma and be very leery of getting tangled into some of the more literal minded interpretations of things. But when you move to the more figurative understandings that are being offered in many theological texts, they're opening models for self understanding that help people shape themselves in terms of who they ought to be. I mean, I think it's T.S. Eliot, right? He says we don't know who we are until we know who we ought to be. And there's something about a sense of who we ought to be that helps guide our self-development, our becoming, and our growth. And when we understand ourselves as made in the image of God, or made in the image of divinity, or even to have some inkling of divine inspiration, that it can set overdrawn expectations. It can be forms of perversion. It can be forms of mental illness and stress, right? I think that that's fair enough, but it also can be a great way of helping people liberate themselves out of too low visioned of expectations of themselves. It may help, if you take some of the great works of art and imagine how much those people believing that God were going to witness, that God would witness the works of art were. I mean, that was part of the impetus to the creation, that the taking themselves seriously in their artistic creation was partly made possible by imagining that God, the gods, would look down and take pleasure upon seeing it. Okay, when you move toward, I think, a lot of the modern scientific worldviews, and we now say, well, look, we're descendants of apes, and we can say, okay, well, very good. Well, which apes? Which ones are the ones that are really us? This is where you get all this monogamy And are humans really monogamous or not? And then we say, well, I don't know, let's look to our closest primates. And we say, well, which ones are they? We say, well, we're not like gorillas, we're more like bonobos, but we're not really as much like orangutan, right? More chimpanzee, right? People get into all of this, and yet as much as that's very helpful, and we don't want to deny the usefulness of any of that, it starts to break down. We can't find the answer that we're looking for, which is something which shoulders the burden for us of having to, I guess, carry the weight of responsibility of self-fashioning, of making something of ourselves, of having to deal with creating an image of ourselves out of what we think are our own best possible interests. And I think one of the tensions that's really interesting is that what is it about humans? Well, it seems to be something like we're naturally multi-leveled abstract dealers of form. That is, we deal in what's partly not there by dealing with things in their abstract isomorphisms, in the ways that they can be similar to something. It's not grounded in simply the materiality that you would find, say, in genetics. Now, it could be genetics, and this is where the chimpanzee stuff gets interesting. Okay, so we say, well, we're more like chimpanzees and we're more like bonobos, right, than we are like, say, gorillas or orangutans, or depends upon certain, which lineage of primate. But why hang it on nearest primate? I mean, in some ways we're more similar to certain kinds of songbirds. That is, there's certain capacities of discourse and prolonged maturation that is related to learning a kind of musical way of relating to others in their species, a kind of grooming at a distance. Right now, primates are mute. The bulk of primates are mute. Humans are a kind of vocalizing primate. Let's go to dogs. When you move to dogs, even though dogs are much less genetically similar to us, we have bred them genetically for those characteristics that we call human, and in some way they seem more human than primates do. Register of intention display, looking at pointing, certain kinds of register of human affect. There does seem to be something that we have cultivated out of dogs that we call humanness, that's independent of the particular genetic similarity to primates, or even the isomorphic similarity that we have to those primates. Push the envelope even further. See, these same people who are going to give the anti-religious arguments, which perhaps for good reason, but as they're suggesting that the way to understand ourselves is through genetic inheritance and through genetic similarity and through, again, this, I guess we're going to limit it to cross fertility and nearest primate relative. What about the whole field that's emerging with artificial intelligence? The degree to which some people want to say that there soon enough will be an artificial intelligence that rivals or resembles humanity, that humans will mistake for another person, that you will be able to have a conversation and an interaction, perhaps fall in love with a robot that you will be able to treat as if it were human. Now, this is despite the fact that it has no genetic endowment at all, has no genes, has no millions and millions and millions of years of shared evolutionary pressure, and instead it's a human invention and creation that we're going to say is somehow more like us. That is, what must we be thinking of ourselves? Who must we think ourselves to be if we can simultaneously drift around between thinking that we're made in the image of God, taking ourselves to be made in the image of, I guess, a lineage of a kind of singing, dancing primate, but who also could be so disembodied from the material flesh, so removed from genetic inheritance and the millions of years of genetic endowment, so that we could say, well, yes, I'm more similar to that machine than I am to my, I don't know, various primate or even mammalian relatives. This question of who are we, I think, is really, really fascinating. Where do we look for the answer, and what is it about looking for the answer, about not knowing what it is that is the best model for us, which is itself a kind of answer to what it is we are? I mean, how is the abstract management of form, the dealing of form, of always somehow being more than and other than here in the materiality, part of what it is that makes us who we are? Yeah, thanks.